Hello, this is Lauren of Wearing History, and I have a tutorial for you for how to sew the waist treatment of the Montana skirt. This pattern is available on my site. I need to note this pattern has no waist ease. It's exactly like the period original it was taken from. So if you need extra ease, you need to add it before you start this tutorial. The first thing that you're going to do is to interface half of your waist tabs and then stitch them right sides together. I'm going to trim it down to 1/8 inch and clip my corners. You can see on the right hand side I have top stitched mine, and then I put the buttonhole on. You do not need to top stitch. I chose to do that for a workwear look. After you've done this, you can turn it right side out, and then you want to press it. You can have a loop turner like this. You can get them online or at a craft store, and this is a point tool. I don't remember what they're called. And you can also get those at craft stores or sewing stores. After it's pressed, it looks like that. Make sure your buttonhole is marked. Then I top stitched it, and then I put my buttonhole on. So that's what they look like. You're going to take it to your waist, and for this one, I made sure to top stitch it. Not top stitch, stay stitch. Make sure that you mark it on the side it's supposed to be. So compare this to your pattern illustrations and make sure, because the one side is different than the other side. So if it looks like this, where the lines are like this and then the laps on the other side, you're doing it right. So you want to slip stitch these into place like the pattern originally said. You do this all by hand. Now it does take a long time, but it looks really nice when it's done. You could probably top stitch this by machine. You're never going to see it because this is the inside of the waist, but I chose to do it the way the original 1940s pattern said to do it. I made my thread too long, which made it a little bit of a pain in the butt too. So you're going to go down both sides. And you can see that I chose to pin it right down the center. That's because my tabs had enough body that they weren't going to wiggle around on me. You definitely should interface these, even though the pattern doesn't call for it, because I found that even with the interfacing and the top stitching, mine still kind of wiggle around a little bit. So you want some stability in there. If you're using a heavier fabric like a denim or a twill, you may not need to interface, but you test it out, see what works for you. Make sure you knot off this stitching. I'm stopping my stitching a little bit in from the waist because I don't want to nip it when I do my future steps. So go down the other side just like that. Notice I only stitched it halfway to the waistband, not the other half. So you're going to match your overlap to the edge of your zipper. I have a zipper tutorial on my site that you can check. And then I'm going to move it in at 1/2 inch on the other side. 1/2 inch is the seam allowance on this particular pattern. You're going to want to match your center backs, your center fronts, your side seams, and your notches. This got a little bit confusing for me because I wasn't paying much attention, so make sure that you just take your time, and if you need to unpin it and remark things, it's totally fine to do that. After I've done it like that, I'm going to mark it on the inside because I find that I like sewing it. Well, it depends on what I'm sewing. If it has, see, there's extra ease, and I'm checking it out here because this was the way the original period pattern was. There is a little bit extra ease that you're going to have to wiggle in there. And that's just the way that it was made in the time period. That is period correct for this particular pattern. So wiggle that in there. If you need to do basting to ease in that extra excess at the particular spot, then it's okay to do that. When the skirt's done, you don't even notice it at all that it has that excess in there. It might have been for movement. This was sort of a sporting outfit. It just depends. And like I said, make sure that the back extension is going towards the back of the skirt. And then the front with the only 1/2 inch seam allowance is at the front of the skirt. When you're pinning this in, you need to know that I'm pinning it right now to the side that doesn't have the tabs stitched on it. This is the waistband part that is just waistband. the part where you stitch the tabs in, that goes on the inside of the skirt waist so that they can then fold over and button. So I'm easing in the excess here. What I'm doing is putting a couple of pins and then splitting the difference. This kind of eases everything around so that I won't get any like big puckers. You can also do a little bit of basting there by hand and then draw it in similar to what you do on a sleeve head, if that's easier for you. It probably honestly would have been easier if I had done that. So then you stitch it using your seam allowance, which is 1/2 inch. So I'm going to my machine now and I'm going to show you a little bit about easing these. So I use my pin to push it through, and in that way I can get really controlled with how much I'm feeding through the machine at any given time. This is why you need to make sure that you split the excess evenly between the pins, or else you're going to end up with a big pucker. You don't want to do that. Now, if you do get a big pucker, you can always take the seam out with a seam ripper, baste it in, and try it again. You can baste it before sewing. Sometimes that's really helpful when things are really fiddly too. Sometimes working with old patterns is kind of interesting, but I feel like the rewards are generally worth the effort. Okay, so once you get to the back, you can back stitch it. You can see the extension that's coming out. That basting line on your waistband, that's where the edge of the zipper matches up on the extension. Now I'm going to sew my extension. So I'm going to clip the seam allowance up 1/2 inch. My scissors were super dull. That's why it looked like I was taking a big cut, but I really wasn't. So you can see it's 1/2 inch, and then I'm going to stitch just that little L shape right there. I'm going to back stitch it, and then I'm going to pivot it on the needle by putting the needle down with the wheel. And then I'm going to pivot it and stitch it and back stitch it. Then you're going to trim that down. You're going to turn it right side out, and you're going to point those little points with your turning tool. I don't think I had it handy, so I just was wiggling it around. Just make sure they get nice. And then you're going to turn under 1/2 inch seam allowance. You can see that I've run a basting stitch on my machine where 1/2 inch is, and you're going to pin it to place. Now you can obviously see that the tabs are on the inside of the skirt. This is what you want. I forgot to video that I did the other side. So the front also got stitched down at 1/2 inch seam allowance, just like the back. Except for it was a straight seam and not like an L-shaped seam. So pin this, make sure that it's nice and smooth. You want the grain line going straight up and down. You don't want it to be rolling or have any puckers. Go as slow as you need to. Just make sure that you're paying attention to what the fabric wants to do. This is why it's really important to cut things on grain, because the grain is very important when you're putting together a professional looking garment. You can see the excess there right below the waistband. It almost looks like little gathers. It was sort of like just extra ease for movement. Make sure everything is turned up. You want to basically just cover that last row of stitching that you did. And the seam allowance of the skirt should be facing up towards the waistband, so it's being encased right now. Okay, now you're going to stitch it either by hand or by machine. I chose to do it by hand. I forgot to press it before I did this video, so yours will look a lot smoother after you press it. Now fold down the tabs, and you're going to check your button placement to see if anything shifted while you've sewn it. I am sticking a pin right there, and then I'm marking it just with a pencil. No one's ever going to see it. And I'm going to remove that basting, and now I am putting my button right there. Do the same for all sides. And then after you've done it, you want to button them to make sure that everything works. Your belt will then go through the belt loops that you made with the tabs. I don't show the belt in this video because I figure belts are pretty straightforward. So I'm doing the same on the back. And those ones looked good, so now I can remove all of my basting and my skirt will be pretty much done. So I'm taking all of my basting out. Not done, but close to done. At this point, you start thinking about other projects, right? So taking all of my basting out, making sure that everything looks really good. And then after you've taken the basting out, you can press up the hem. After you've pressed up the hem and you've pinned that in place and sewn it, then you can press your pleats back. But you know where your pleats are supposed to go now because of how you've thread marked it or basted them. You can actually leave the basting in until the hem is all the way done and just take the basting out. Hope this has been beneficial. You can find my patterns at wearinghistory.clothing or Wearing History on Etsy for e-patterns.